This is part 3 of the series on exploring Ubuntu Touch, and if you haven't seen the first 2 videos on the topic, then I recommend that you watch those first. In this video, I'm going to give you an honest statement about how Ubuntu Touch works and some of the challenges one may have on this platform. And we'll also talk about whether there are workarounds or alternatives. Stay tuned. I'm going to be honest about some aspects of Ubuntu Touch and expectations of a typical Linux user. Now, if you're just using this as a consumer of electronic products and not as a Linux user, some of what I will say may not be as important. We're going to discuss 2 aspects of Ubuntu Touch. One, we'll talk about some usability issues because of design choices. And 2, we'll talk about general Linux compatibility, which affects how apps are made and a general use of something called convergence, which is how phone and desktop use the same platform. Before I get into this, let me say that some people at Ubports may not agree with me, and I'm sure they have a certain vision that may be different from what I see, and that's okay. What makes me different though is that the feedback I'm getting is from a new community of people who are interested in Linux phones and have not used Ubuntu Touch before. This is going to be a new and large group of people, and I've been talking to so many of these people here on YouTube and on my platform on brax.me. So in a sense, I'm feeling the vibe of a new group of potential new users. I've already personally brought many people to Ubuntu Touch. I've installed it for many of you on many phones that I've lost count. I think that by now I understand the architecture of Ubuntu Touch. I've done some pretty extensive research, testing, modifying system applications, seeing what I can do on Libertine-Containers, and playing with app creation. And by the way, let me say that the Ubports community is amazing. Dedicated people from all over the globe, helping each other mostly on Telegram. Everyone's been fantastic, and this is really one of the biggest pluses of this community. I think that this platform is succeeding and will continue to succeed in the long run. And personally, I use an Ubuntu Touch phone. But there are issues with Ubuntu Touch. Those wanting to know what to expect on this platform will want an honest review and not an image of perfection which does not exist in real life. Now, after this video, if you haven't used Ubuntu Touch before, then you shouldn't be having surprises. First, let's talk about usability issues. Just to review the history of Ubuntu Touch, it was a project started by Canonical in 2015 and abandoned in 2017. Although it is still called Ubuntu Touch, it is actually no longer connected directly to Canonical. It is maintained by Ubports and everything is open source. The whole mobile framework and UI of Ubuntu Touch was first conceptualized by Canonical, so a lot of the UI work is actually the original work of Canonical. Some parts of what makes Ubuntu Touch unique are actually still tied to Canonical projects, and this relates to architecture that's still in use by Ubuntu, the distro, which is a different thing. So Ubuntu, the distro, is not directly connected now to Ubuntu Touch. Ubuntu Touch, however, is built using Ubuntu 16.04, and it's the main OS. Back to Canonical. Canonical started from scratch here and made decisions related to the UI, which is not what you would be used to seeing on Android or iOS. The UI framework is actually embedded deep into a modified Qt architecture, or Qt, that's specifically made for Ubuntu Touch by Canonical. So it's not a simple matter to even entertain a UI modification. One of the obvious choices in Ubuntu Touch is that the UI uses very small icons and very small text. This can be off-putting to some, especially if you're used to iOS or Android. The tiny text can be hard to read, especially for older folks. The fonts are very thin and are hard to read in the daytime. Now, on the other hand, if you can get used to this, they can fit a lot more stuff in a smaller space, so you don't have to dig deeper in menus as much. The touch areas are very tiny, and this is not at all consistent with the design style on iOS and Android, where large single-handed operations in quick use is more possible because large touch zones are more forgiving to users. On Ubuntu Touch, swipe gestures are available mostly for the OS. It's pretty hard to use swipe in an app because it interferes with the use of it by the OS. The only main gesture that is easily used on an app would be the bottom edge swipe. In contrast, on iOS or Android, the OS typically uses more of the top edge and bottom edge for OS functions and leaves the easier to use side swipes to the apps. On Ubuntu Touch, it is quite difficult for an app to integrate a side swipe without interfering with a side edge swipe. An example of this would be the launching of the photo gallery while in a camera app. It is quite difficult to use. Many things on the phone are not made to be used single-handed. Young people are very used to using their phones with one hand. Not too easy on many of the screens because the icons are small and have a very particular placement and are very close together. This means that gross navigation movements are not suitable for this phone. After developing many apps for iOS and Android, I can tell you that there is almost a rebelliousness here about being different. In fact, if you compare Ubuntu Touch to Android or iOS, there'll be a sense of, don't mess with us. And frankly, I don't mind it, mostly. But randomly showing the interface to young people, you can see the reactions when they study the swipe movements. There are cases when I do mind the UI. For example, there are too many clicks to using the dialer to make a call. It's impossible to make a call with one hand or without full attention to the screen. Because there's an unresolved bug on Bluetooth on my Nexus 5, I was forced to dial out in a car and I just wanted to call and put it in speaker mode while at a traffic stop. There were too many clicks to do this and I couldn't do it. But what's nice in an open source project is that instead of complaining about it, we need to become part of the solution. So since I didn't like how the dialer worked, I downloaded the source code and made some quick changes for now and submitted it back for review. Whether they take it or not doesn't matter because in the meantime the change is on my phone, so I'm using it the way I want it with less clicks. So there's so much that can be done by the community to tweak whatever you don't like. Fortunately, I'm a software developer, so no big deal. And I'll commit to making more changes in the future. I also made a version of my Brax.me app for the Ubuntu Touch Open Store and it's there now. Again, I want to contribute to the community. So to summarize my thoughts on usability, the platform looks different than others. This may be okay or not okay for you. It's not for everyone. But I'd rather use this than spying Android or iOS regardless of their more extensive app choices. So I've cast my vote. Now, as an extensive and advanced Linux user, what really gives me pause is the next issue. Let's talk about Linux compatibility. This is a significant issue with Ubuntu Touch because Canonical, when they first made this, decided they were going to be different. Initially in relation to the display server, Mir, and later we'll talk about how they approach desktop apps and loading of external apps with something called a Libertine-Container. First, let's focus on the display server issue. This is a big difference in the current Ubuntu Touch. And this is partly because of the history of changes that happened with the display servers in general in the Linux world and how Canonical approached it. Originally, Linux desktops handled graphics display services using Xwindows or Xorg. I won't get deep into the technicalities here, but apps designed for the older graphics handling used Xwindows as their graphics framework. Xwindows had issues primarily with bloat and also with security since there is no app separation in Xwindows. Platforms and graphical toolkits, primarily GTK and Qt, which are used heavily in newer apps, mostly shifted and now use a display protocol called Wayland. Now, this Wayland protocol was not completely finished at the time when Ubuntu Touch was being made, so Canonical invested time in making their own display services, both a client and a server part, called Mir Server and Mir Client. They also made a compatibility layer that allowed Xwindows apps to talk to Mir, and this was called Xmir. Now, Mir is specific to Canonical, so no other distro uses Mir. Everyone else used Xwindows and then migrated to Wayland, which is now mainlined. And by the way, Mir is a project that is still run by Canonical. Well, unfortunately, this battle is deep within Ubuntu Touch itself. Mir is the basis of Ubuntu Touch today, and so many apps, for example those based on GTK, do not work as well on Mir, which has been optimized on a specific adaptation of Qt that is tied to Mir and to the whole UI framework. There is some support for GTK inside Ubuntu 16.04, but because of other dependency issues, it failed for me. Then I even tried simple Qt apps, and here we find that it's not a regular Qt either because of the tight integration with Mir. It's really more suited for using Qt Quick with QML, so that's a specific kind of Qt, so that you are using existing libraries. And due to the fact that Ubuntu Touch is a read-only OS by default, it doesn't play too well with being made read-write. For example, it uses some small partitions on Android, like the cache partition, which will run out of space if you use apt-get. So this is a bigger issue for an app developer like me. If your particular graphics toolkit does not have support for Mir, or an app you're trying to port has no way to move to Mir, then you are basically in a dead end for now. In essence, it is difficult to port an app to the main OS even for testing purposes, if it isn't designed with Qt Quick QML in mind. Obviously, these are not issues that would concern me if I developed on unrestricted Linux distros for mobile like Postmarket OS. And maybe I have to use Postmarket OS for certain things. I'll be talking about Postmarket OS in future videos, and I'll try out other distros too that work on the PinePhone like Manjaro. Now, Canonical did understand this choice to make the main Ubuntu Touch OS more locked down. So, they made an alternative. Ubuntu Touch is actually made of two separate instances of Linux. The main Ubuntu Touch is the Mobile Enhanced framework, but there is a chroot inside it that runs only a plain vanilla Ubuntu 16.04, and this is called the Libertine-Container. This Libertine-Container has no Ubuntu Touch libraries. It's really a plain vanilla 16.04 without a desktop environment. So, in my testing, I can successfully and without restriction use apt-get, install, and run non-graphical Python apps, and it works fine. You have to run in a bash shell inside this Libertine container, but it's fine. So if I'm doing, let's say, command line cybersecurity coding with Python in a non-graphical environment, this would be very usable. Where the issue is when it has to interact with a graphical environment. And of course, that has to occur on Ubuntu Touch itself to run the graphics. In order for graphical applications to run, they have to support X Windows and then run in the X Windows compatibility mode of Mir called Xmir. Then Xmir will take charge of sending the graphical output to the Mir server, which is running on the host Ubuntu Touch. I've successfully installed Wireshark and the whole LibreOffice suite and some other apps on the Libertine container. But I've also failed in installing many apps. For example, for ham radio, I never got GNU Radio or FLDigi running on it. Firefox, for example, can be installed and it is incompatible enough with Xmir that the graphics is very slow. Now, the Libertine container is made for a desktop. It has no responsive UI built in. It expects that the apps running on it will be in a desktop. So basically, they're unusable because of the small screen size. Although I could actually use Wireshark with a sharp tip pointer and maybe a microscope to see the screen. But in theory, someone could build a responsive app inside a Libertine container. Well, that someone could have been me. I wrote an app for GNOME, which I intended for the Librem 5. It partially ran on a Libertine container after some tweaks, but mostly it crashed just like many other apps. The reason it crashes is mostly again because of the Xmir to Mir communications. So while the main Ubuntu Touch uses Mir, the Libertine container runs Xmir, the X Windows compatibility layer of Mir, and I don't think this was completely done beyond the experimental stage, and there are definitely bugs in there. It is not ready for prime time. The next biggest problem that Ubuntu Touch would have, aside from Mir, is that it runs on Ubuntu 16.04 rather than a newer Linux version. And the kernels vary depending on what is provided by the device. Those can be as old as 3.1. So this was frustrating for me since I couldn't get my app to run. I could get it running, but I'd have to switch to Qt, or probably more precisely, a particular version of Qt Quick with QML. But even as I tried to do that, I get more errors because Xmere has been deprecated and it is going to be a dead end. Yes, Xmere is no longer supported. So you actually get errors saying there's a problem with the Xmere client. However, do not fret. The reason for my difficulties is that Ubuntu Touch is in the middle of a transition. Canonical created a new version of the Mir server that is now Wayland compatible. This means that Mir can work like Wayland and thus be compatible with everything in the future. This is good news, and since it is actively supported by Canonical, it is intended for long-term use. Canonical wants this version of Mir to be used by other distros, since it is completely compatible with Wayland. And this, I believe, is the version being tested on the PinePhone. So very soon, Ubuntu Touch will be compatible with Wayland apps. This will likely mean upgrading all the dependencies in Ubuntu Touch so that the graphical toolkit will work more like we expect. It also means that the Libertine container would also act more like a standard Linux install. So we are not there yet, but it looks like it's coming soon. I'm definitely going to play with it on the PinePhone to see how this is progressing. Another problem that I specifically had was Ubuntu 16.04. Some of the included libraries were incompatible with newer code. Well, as I explained in my prior video, Ubuntu Touch is actually operating separately from Ubuntu 16.04 anyway. Ubuntu Touch is running as a chroot inside Ubuntu 16.04. So it is quite doable to switch to Ubuntu 20. Whatever, although this is not necessarily a top priority, but it will likely happen in 2020, maybe later in the year. So with these major changes, Ubuntu Touch should be more similar to Postmarket OS, which is more of a mainline Linux distro on a phone. App development is quite a bit more difficult than Ubuntu Touch, and for this it would seem like using Postmarket OS would be the better choice for me. So in future videos, I'm going to go deep into playing with Postmarket OS. Fortunately, on a PinePhone, you can switch OSs simply by changing the SD card. So when I'm doing development work, I don't have to destroy my Ubuntu Touch installation. I was going to demonstrate the use of Ubuntu Touch Libertine-Containers in this video, which I thought would have been fun for some of my viewers who do ham radio, for example, since some ham radio apps could be run. But I decided to hold off because the Libertine container is clearly experimental at this stage. I'll wait for the conversion to Wayland to occur first, so hopefully just a temporary delay. Now, there's a desktop-compatible graphics environment that, in theory, can be run on any distro. This is Unity 8. Canonical no longer uses Unity since they switched to GNOME in Ubuntu 18.04. But Unity 8 runs the Mir graphics stack, so if someone wanted to develop app compatibility between Ubuntu Touch and a desktop, this could assure one that the apps on both the desktop and phone would be on the same graphics framework. However, as an app developer, this seems to be a restrictive approach. Most of us want to develop apps that work on more platforms, and tying one specifically to Mir is problematic until after the Wayland integration is complete and in production. There is, however, value in the use of Unity 8 for other touch devices, such as tablets, which require a responsive interface, but not the restrictions of a standard Linux distro. And I hear that Debian is actually packaging Unity 8, so this will potentially have a future. So, in conclusion, some of the issues with Ubuntu Touch relate to what one's goal is. As a software developer, Ubuntu Touch is too locked down and customized. So some of what I want to do may have to be explored on other OSs like Postmarket OS, Manjaro, and even Phosh on the Librem 5. Now, Postmarket OS is a bit different because it uses Halium and is compatible with many Android devices. Manjaro is specifically for a PinePhone and not for other mobile devices. For daily phone use, I will continue to use Ubuntu Touch while watching the progress of other mobile environments like Phosh, LunaOS, Plasma Mobile, Neon, and Sailfish OS. Nothing is perfect, however. All those other options have limitations. But definitely 2020 will be the year we'll see if Linux takes a bite off the mobile world. It's about time. If you like this video, it would be great if you hit the thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. More of these in-depth topics will be coming soon. And thanks for watching.